The paramedic looked at me like I'd personally caused a medical emergency, then glanced back at the unconscious woman sprawled dramatically across my driveway. "Sir, she's claiming your ranch gate triggered a severe anxiety attack, requiring immediate medical intervention." I stared at the same wrought iron gate my grandfather installed in 1952, the one that had survived Montana winters, summer storms, and 7 decades of ranch life, but apparently couldn't survive Cordelia Whitmore and her HOA violation notices. What I didn't know yet was that her theatrical fainting spell would expose a conspiracy that reached from our quiet subdivision all the way to the state attorney general's office. Before I dive into how a ranch gate became the center of a federal investigation, I want to acknowledge everyone who's been sharing their HOA horror stories in the comments. Your experiences remind me why these stories matter. And if this resonates with you, a quick like helps these stories reach people who need to hear them. For those who've been using the thanks button to support this work, you're helping me travel to meet the whistleblowers, the everyday heroes, and the people whose voices deserve amplification. Every contribution helps me spend more time investigating and less time worrying about funding, which means I can take the time to get these details right. Now, let me take you back to that September morning in Willowbrook Estates, when I learned that sometimes the most dangerous person in your neighborhood wears a laminated badge and carries a homeowners association manual like a weapon. My name is Garrett Pemberton, and I'm probably the last person you'd expect to find in the middle of an HOA war. I'm 34, work in tech consulting, and moved to Willowbrook specifically because it seemed like the kind of quiet community where the biggest drama would be someone forgetting to bring in their trash cans. The subdivision sits on the outskirts of Bozeman, Montana, 300 homes built around a man-made lake, complete with a clubhouse, tennis courts, and swimming pool that the marketing materials promised would create resort-style living in big sky country. What those marketing materials didn't mention was Cordelia Whitmore. Cordelia had been HOA president for 18 months when I moved in, and she ran the community like her personal fiefdom. She was 48, impeccably dressed, even at 7 a.m., and had the kind of smile that made you check your wallet afterward. Her background was impressive on paper: former city planning director from Denver, master's degree in urban development, and enough credentials to fill a small library. What I would discover later was that credentials and character are two very different things. My property sat on the edge of the development, where the manicured lawns gave way to the original ranch land that my family had owned since the 1940s. When the developers bought most of our acreage, my father negotiated to keep 5 acres and the original ranch house, complete with the historic gate that marked the entrance to what had once been Pemberton Ranch. The gate wasn't just decorative, it was a piece of Montana history, hand-forged by local artisans and featuring the family brand that had been registered with the state for over 70 years. The trouble started 3 weeks after I moved in, when Cordelia appeared at my door with her first violation notice. "Mr. Pemberton," she announced, consulting her ever-present clipboard, "I'm here regarding a significant aesthetic concern that's been brought to the HOA board's attention." She gestured toward my gate with the kind of disdain usually reserved for roadkill. "This structure violates our community standards regarding entrance treatments and creates an inconsistent visual experience for residents and guests." I looked at the gate, then back at Cordelia, waiting for the punchline that never came. "You're serious?" "Completely serious. The Willowbrook Estates covenants, conditions, and restrictions clearly state that all entrance features must conform to approved community aesthetics. This gate predates our standards and must be brought into compliance or removed entirely." She handed me a thick packet of papers that included violation photographs, compliance deadlines, and a fine schedule that started at $500 for the first week and doubled every 7 days thereafter. The paperwork was thorough, professional, and completely insane. "Mrs. Whitmore," I said, trying to keep my voice reasonable, "this gate has been here for 70 years. It's literally older than the subdivision. It's also on my property, not HOA common area." Her smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in her eyes. "Mr. Pemberton, your property line may be historical, but your HOA membership began the moment you closed on your home. Our standards apply to all visible structures, regardless of their age or sentimental value. You have 14 days to submit a compliance plan or face escalating financial penalties. That's when I made my first mistake. I laughed. You can't be serious about this. It's a gate. It's not hurting anyone. It's well maintained. And it's been here since before anyone in this subdivision was even born. Cordelia's expression shifted from professional courtesy to something that looked almost predatory. Mr. Pemberton, I can see this is going to be a challenging adjustment for you. Perhaps you need time to review our community guidelines more thoroughly. But let me be very clear, selective enforcement based on personal preferences or historical sentiment creates liability issues for the HOA board. We treat all violations equally, regardless of circumstances. The phrase, selective enforcement, stuck with me as she walked away. Clicking across my driveway in heels that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment. There was something about the way she said it that suggested she was very familiar with the concept, but maybe not in the way she was presenting it. Over the next week, I did something Cordelia probably wasn't expecting. I started paying attention to HOA enforcement patterns throughout the community. What I discovered was fascinating and disturbing in equal measure. The Hendersons, an elderly African-American couple who lived 3 streets over, had received 17 violation notices in the past 6 months for infractions ranging from inappropriate mailbox height to non-conforming garden gnome placement. Meanwhile, the Ashfords, who lived in one of the most expensive homes in the development, had a bright purple front door that clearly violated the approved color palette, but had never received so much as a warning. The Sanchez family, recent immigrants who worked double shifts to afford their modest home in the subdivision, were being fined for parking their work van in their own driveway. Apparently, commercial vehicles weren't allowed in residential areas after 6 p.m. But 3 houses down, Dr. Richardson kept his restored 1967 Camaro parked in his front yard under a car cover, and nobody seemed to notice that it leaked oil onto the community sidewalk. I started documenting everything with photos and dates, initially just out of curiosity, but increasingly out of a growing sense that something was fundamentally wrong with how our community was being managed. That's when I met Yolanda Reeves. Yolanda was 62. A retired social worker who lived near the community lake and had been quietly documenting HOA activities for over a year. She knocked on my door on a Saturday morning, introducing herself as a neighbor who'd heard about my gate situation. "Honey," she said, settling into my kitchen chair with the confidence of someone who'd spent decades navigating bureaucratic nonsense, "you need to understand what you're really dealing with here. This isn't about your gate. This is about control. And you just became a test case." She opened a folder that contained meticulous records of HOA board meetings, violation patterns, and financial expenditures that painted a picture of systematic discrimination disguised as community standards enforcement. Cordelia's been targeting specific residents since she took office, Yolanda explained, spreading documents across my table. "Look at the pattern: families of color, elderly residents on fixed incomes, anyone who works blue-collar jobs or doesn't fit her vision of what this community should look like." She uses the CCRs like a weapon, finding violations that technically exist, but applying them selectively. The evidence was overwhelming. The Hendersons weren't being harassed because their mailbox was 2 inches too tall. They were being harassed because Cordelia wanted them gone. The Sanchez family wasn't being fined for parking violations. They were being financially pressured to sell and move somewhere more appropriate for their income level. "But here's the thing," Yolanda continued. "You're different. You're white, you work in tech, you can afford legal representation, and you have community standing. She can't use her usual playbook on you. So she's trying to establish precedent with something she thinks is defensible, aesthetic, standards, compliance." That's when I understood why Cordelia had seemed so confident during our first encounter. She wasn't just trying to remove my gate, she was trying to prove that even historical landmarks weren't immune to her authority. If she could force me to comply with arbitrary standards, she could justify any enforcement action against any resident. "What do we do about it?" I asked. Yolanda smiled for the first time since she'd arrived. "We document everything. We build allies. And we give her enough rope to hang herself. But first, we get you a really good recording device." The recording device turned out to be brilliant advice. I installed a small, high-quality audio recorder near my front door that activated automatically whenever someone approached. It was completely legal. Montana is a one-party consent state, and I was recording conversations on my own property. Cordelia's return visit 3 days later provided exactly the kind of evidence we needed. She arrived at 6:30 a.m. with 2 men in polo shirts, who she introduced as compliance inspectors. One carried a measuring tape. The other held a tablet with what appeared to be architectural software. "Mr. Pemberton," Cordelia announced, "we're here to conduct the formal assessment required before proceeding with enforcement action. These gentlemen are certified HOA compliance specialists who will document the specific violations for our legal record." I watched from my kitchen window as the specialists spent 45 minutes measuring my gate, photographing it from every angle, and entering data into their tablet. What struck me as odd was how much time they spent measuring and photographing areas that had nothing to do with the gate my driveway. The sight lines from various angles, even the distance from my house to the property line. When they finished, Cordelia approached my door with a satisfied expression and a manila folder thick enough to choke a horse. "Mr. Pemberton, our assessment confirms multiple violations beyond the original aesthetic concerns. Your gate structure encroaches into the community sightline corridor, creates potential liability for emergency vehicle access, and fails to meet current safety standards for residential entrance features." She handed me the folder, which contained professional-looking reports, detailed measurements, and photographs that made my 70-year-old gate look like a public safety hazard. The compliance specialist had documented violations I'd never heard of, referenced HOA standards that weren't in my original CC/R documents, and recommended immediate removal with a timeline that gave me less than a week to comply. "This is ridiculous," I said, flipping through reports that read like they'd been written by actual engineers. "Half of these standards don't exist in our community guidelines, and the other half are being applied retroactively to a structure that predates the HOA by decades." That's when Cordelia made the mistake that would eventually destroy her entire operation. "Mr. Pemberton," she said, her voice taking on the tone of someone explaining basic concepts to a particularly slow child, "community standards evolve to protect property values and ensure resident safety. Your attachment to outdated structures demonstrates exactly the kind of backward thinking that threatens progressive community development." She paused, glancing around my property with an expression that made my skin crawl. "Frankly, properties like yours, with their rustic aesthetic and historical pretensions, create drag on community advancement. We have an opportunity to transform Willowbrook into something truly special, but that requires residents who understand that progress sometimes means letting go of the past." The recording device captured every word, including the barely concealed contempt in her voice, when she said properties like yours and historical pretensions, but more importantly, it captured her admission that this wasn't really about gate compliance. It was about forcing out residents who didn't fit her vision of community advancement. That evening, I called Yolanda to share the recording. Her reaction was immediate and electric. "Honey, you just got her on tape, admitting to discriminatory enforcement based on socioeconomic targeting. That's a federal civil rights violation disguised as community standards enforcement." She was right. But we both knew that one recording wouldn't be enough to challenge someone with Cordelia's resources and connections. We needed more evidence, more witnesses, and a strategy that would expose the full scope of what was happening in our community. That's when Yolanda introduced me to Marcus Chen, a civil rights attorney who specialized in housing discrimination cases. Marcus was 38, sharp as a razor, and had built his career on cases that other lawyers considered too complicated or politically sensitive to touch. "What you're describing," Marcus said after reviewing our documentation, "is a textbook case of discriminatory enforcement under the Fair Housing Act. The HOA is using facially neutral policies to target specific residents based on race, national origin, and economic status. The question isn't whether violations are occurring, it's whether we can prove pattern and intent." He explained that HOA discrimination cases were notoriously difficult to prosecute because the violations were technically legitimate. Even when the enforcement was selective, we needed to demonstrate not just that different standards were being applied to different residents, but that those different standards were based on protected characteristics. "Your gate situation is actually perfect for this," Marcus continued. "They can't claim you're being targeted for race or income, so they have to justify their enforcement on legitimate grounds. If we can prove those grounds are pretextual, that they're really about something else, we can use your case to expose the broader pattern. The plan Marcus outlined was brilliant and risky in equal measure. We would let Cordelia escalate her enforcement actions while documenting everything, building a federal case that would encompass not just my situation, but the systematic discrimination affecting the entire community. The key, Marcus explained, is giving her enough rope to hang herself while protecting the other residents who are being targeted. We need her to demonstrate her true motivations clearly enough that even sympathetic observers can't ignore what's really happening. 2 days later, Cordelia provided exactly the kind of escalation we needed, but in a way that none of us had anticipated. I was working in my home office when I heard shouting from my driveway. Through the window, I could see Cordelia standing near my gate with what appeared to be a work crew, 3 men in hard hats carrying crowbars and a portable jackhammer. I grabbed my phone and rushed outside, hitting record as I approached the group. "What exactly is happening here?" I called out. Cordelia turned with a smile that looked genuinely triumphant. "Mr. Pemberton, your compliance deadline expired yesterday. The HOA board has authorized immediate removal of the non-compliant structure to prevent further community liability exposure. You can't just destroy my property," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the adrenaline flooding my system. "This is my private property, and you don't have legal authority to remove anything." That's when she pulled out another manila folder, this one containing what appeared to be court documents. "Actually, Mr. Pemberton, we do. The HOA has obtained a preliminary injunction authorizing removal of structures that pose imminent safety hazards to community residents. Your gate has been classified as a public nuisance that creates liability for emergency vehicle access." She handed me papers that looked official enough to be legitimate, complete with court seals and judge signatures that meant nothing to me but everything to the legal system. According to the documentation, my gate posed such a significant threat to public safety that immediate removal was not just authorized but mandated. The work crew was already setting up their equipment when I made the call that changed everything. "Marcus," I said, stepping away from the group while keeping my phone camera trained on the activity. "They're here with court orders and they're about to destroy my gate. Don't let them touch anything." Marcus replied immediately, "Those papers are either fake or obtained through fraudulent representations. Keep recording. Keep them talking. And whatever you do, don't physically interfere. Let them commit their crimes on camera." That's exactly what happened. Marcus was 38, sharp as a razor, and had built his career on cases that other lawyers considered too complicated or politically sensitive to touch. "What you're describing," Marcus said after reviewing our documentation, "is a textbook case of discriminatory enforcement under the Fair Housing Act. The HOA is using facially neutral policies to target specific residents based on race, national origin, and economic status." Cordelia had created an entire fictional legal proceeding to justify stealing my property, and she'd done it with such confidence that even I had momentarily believed it was legitimate. But the real evidence came from what happened after the gate was destroyed. As the work crew loaded the twisted metal remains into their truck, Cordelia made a phone call that my recording device captured in perfect clarity. "The Pemberton situation is resolved," she said, walking away from the group, but not far enough to escape my audio pickup. "The structure is removed and the property is ready for assessment. You can have your people come out next week to evaluate development potential." Développement potentiel. That phrase echoed in my head as I watched the truck carrying my family's gate disappear down the street. This wasn't about community standards or safety compliance. This was about clearing obstacles for development, and my gate had been standing in the way of someone's construction plans. That evening, Marcus arrived at my house with 2 associates and a plan that would expose the entire conspiracy. "What we're dealing with," Marcus explained, spreading documents across my dining room table, "isn't just HOA overreach. It's a coordinated scheme to manipulate property values and prepare specific areas for redevelopment. Your gate wasn't removed because it violated community standards. It was removed because it interfered with someone's construction access plans." The evidence Marcus's team had uncovered was staggering. Cordelia wasn't just an overzealous HOA president. She was working with a development company that had been quietly acquiring properties throughout the community, targeting specific lots for a massive expansion project that would transform Willowbrook from a residential community into a mixed-use commercial development. The discriminatory enforcement wasn't random. Marcus continued. They were targeting residents who were most likely to sell under pressure, clearing out families who couldn't afford legal challenges while removing physical obstacles to future construction. Your gate was marked for removal because it would interfere with heavy equipment access to the development site. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking. Property records showed that nearly 30 homes in the community had been purchased by shell companies connected to Pinnacle Development Group over the past 18 months. The families who'd been harassed into selling had received offers within weeks of their first HOA violations, often at prices well below market value. Cordelia's role was to create the conditions that would force sales while removing any physical or legal obstacles to the development plan. She was being paid not just her HOA salary, but consulting fees from Pinnacle that totaled over $200,000 per year. But here's the beautiful part. Marcus said with the kind of smile that made me glad he was on our side. They documented everything. Every fraudulent court filing, every discriminatory enforcement action, every coordination with the development company. They created a paper trail that leads directly to federal charges. The next morning, Marcus made the calls that would bring Cordelia's empire crashing down. The first call went to the FBI's Civil Rights Division, reporting a conspiracy to violate federal fair housing laws through systematic discrimination and fraudulent legal proceedings. The second call went to the State Attorney General's office, reporting organized fraud involving fake court documents and unlawful property destruction. The third call went to the local district attorney, reporting theft, vandalism, and conspiracy charges under state law. But the fourth call was the one that turned our situation from a legal case into a community movement. Marcus called Channel 7 News. The story that aired 3 days later was everything we'd hoped for and more. The investigative team had independently verified the discriminatory enforcement patterns, the connections to Pinnacle Development, and the fraudulent court documents that Cordelia had used to justify destroying my gate. The segment featured interviews with the Henderson family, the Sanchez family, and 6 other residents who'd been targeted for selective enforcement. It included recordings of Cordelia's phone conversations, copies of the fake legal documents, and expert testimony about federal fair housing violations. But the moment that made the story go viral was the footage of Cordelia's reaction when reporters confronted her outside the HOA office. "Mrs. Whitmore," the reporter called out as Cordelia tried to rush to her car. "Can you comment on allegations that you've been working with Pinnacle Development to manipulate property values through discriminatory HOA enforcement?" Cordelia stopped, turned toward the camera, and said exactly the wrong thing. "Those allegations are completely unfounded and frankly offensive. The Willowbrook HOA operates according to the highest standards of community governance, and any suggestion that our enforcement actions are motivated by anything other than legitimate community concerns is both false and potentially defamatory." She paused, clearly thinking she was making a strong statement, then added the words that would destroy her credibility forever. "Furthermore, residents who choose to live in planned communities have an obligation to respect community standards, regardless of their personal backgrounds or cultural preferences. If certain residents feel that our guidelines don't accommodate their lifestyle choices, there are other communities that might be more suitable for their needs." Cultural preferences and lifestyle choices coded language that made her discriminatory intent crystal clear to anyone paying attention. The video clip exploded across social media within hours. HOA reform started trending on Twitter. Fair housing organizations began sharing the story as an example of how discrimination hides behind community standards. Legal experts used the case to explain how civil rights violations could be disguised as homeowner enforcement, but the real turning point came 2 days later. When FBI agents arrived at Cordelia's house with search warrants, I was working in my yard when I saw the convoy of black SUVs pull into the community. Within minutes, agents were executing simultaneous searches of Cordelia's home, the HOA office, and Pinnacle Development's local headquarters. The search warrant returns were unsealed 3 weeks later, and they revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. Cordelia wasn't just an overzealous HOA president. She was working with a development company that had been quietly acquiring properties throughout the community, targeting specific lots for a massive expansion project that would transform Willowbrook from a residential community into a mixed-use commercial development. The discriminatory enforcement wasn't random. Marcus continued. The evidence included emails discussing problematic residents who needed to be encouraged to relocate, financial records showing payments from Pinnacle disguised as consulting fees, and architectural plans that showed exactly why my gate had been marked for removal. It would have blocked access to the construction staging area for Pinnacle's luxury resort complex. But the evidence that sealed Cordelia's fate was a recording from her own phone, where she discussed the specific tactics being used to pressure different families. The Hendersons will probably fold after another month of violations, she told her Pinnacle contact. They're on a fixed income and can't afford legal representation. The Sanchez family is trickier because they're more likely to fight, but the parking violations are costing them $500 a week, so they'll break eventually. The recording was played in federal court 6 months later, during the sentencing hearing that sent Cordelia to federal prison for 8 years. The judge's comments during sentencing captured exactly what had happened in our community. Mrs. Whitmore, Judge Patricia Santos said, looking down at Cordelia with barely concealed disgust. You turned a position of community trust into a weapon for discrimination and fraud. You systematically targeted families based on their race, national origin, and economic status, using homeowner association rules as a cover for civil rights violations. The judge paused, consulting her notes before continuing. Your actions weren't just criminal, they were an assault on the fundamental principle that all Americans deserve equal treatment under law. Regardless of their background or circumstances, you perverted the concept of community standards to serve greed and prejudice, and in doing so, you betrayed every resident who trusted you to serve their interests fairly. The sentence was comprehensive. 8 years in federal prison, full restitution to affected families, and a lifetime ban from serving in any HOA governance role. But the moment that gave me the most satisfaction came during the sentencing hearing itself. When Cordelia was led away in handcuffs, as she passed the gallery where affected residents sat watching justice being served, she made eye contact with me for the first time since the investigation began. This isn't over, she whispered, her voice carrying the kind of venom that confirmed everything we'd suspected about her true character. That's when Deputy Marshal Rodriguez leaned down and handed her a small package. Actually, ma'am, it is over. But here's a little something for where you're going. Inside the package was a camping tent, the kind of basic shelter that federal prison camps provide to inmates who arrive without proper accommodations. The symbolism was perfect. Cordelia had spent years trying to eliminate residents who didn't meet her standards of community acceptability. Now she would be spending the next 8 years in accommodations that definitely wouldn't meet her standards of acceptable living. The aftermath of Cordelia's conviction rippled far beyond our community. The Department of Justice launched a nationwide investigation into HOA governance practices, focusing specifically on discriminatory enforcement patterns in planned communities across the country. The Willowbrook case became a textbook example of how civil rights violations could hide behind seemingly neutral community standards, and the legal precedent established by our case made it easier for other residents to challenge discriminatory HOA practices. Pinnacle Development abandoned their expansion plans and sold their properties in the community at significant losses. The new owners committed to maintaining Willowbrook as a residential community with genuine diversity and inclusion. My gate was rebuilt using the original design specifications, and it now carries a historical landmark designation that protects it from any future HOA interference. But more importantly, it stands as a reminder that some things are worth fighting for. Even when the odds seem impossible, the Henderson family, the Sanchez family, and the other residents who were targeted by Cordelia's discrimination all received settlements that allowed them to stay in their homes and recover from the financial damage they'd suffered. Yolanda Reeves was elected as the new HOA president, running on a platform of transparent governance and equal enforcement that actually meant what it said. And Marcus Chen used the publicity from our case to launch a nonprofit organization that provides legal representation to residents facing HOA discrimination across the country. Standing in my driveway 6 months after Cordelia's sentencing, looking at my rebuilt gate gleaming in the Montana sunshine, I thought about the phone call that had started this entire journey. Cordelia's arrogant announcement that my family's history was incompatible with her vision of community progress. She'd been right about one thing. Progress does sometimes require letting go of the past. But the thing she never understood was that real progress means building communities where everyone belongs. Not just the people who meet someone's arbitrary standards of acceptability. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons or wealth, but with documentation, determination, and the simple refusal to accept that discrimination is acceptable when it's dressed up in official language and laminated badges. The camping tent that Cordelia received as her parting gift serves as a reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed, has a way of putting people exactly where they belong. And sometimes, the people who think they're untouchable discover that the law applies to everyone, even HOA presidents who forget that their power comes from serving the community, not ruling over it. If you've experienced HOA discrimination or selective enforcement, know that you're not alone and you're not powerless. Document everything. Build alliances. And remember that the truth has a way of surfacing when people refuse to stay silent. Thanks for following this story. And remember, sometimes the most important stands we take are in defense of things that seem small but represent something much larger, like a 70-year-old gate that became a symbol of the principle that all Americans deserve equal treatment under law. The federal courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and camera crews when Cordelia Whitmore emerged from her sentencing hearing in handcuffs. But what happened next turned our local HOA victory into a national story that would reshape homeowner rights across America. As Deputy Marshal Rodriguez handed Cordelia that camping tent, a symbol of the basic accommodations waiting for her at federal prison camp, she made one final mistake that would expose an even larger conspiracy than any of us had imagined. "You think this ends with me?" she hissed at the cameras, her perfectly composed mask finally slipping completely. "I was just following the playbook. There are dozens of communities running the same operation, and this conviction won't stop any of them." Those words, captured by every news outlet covering the story, triggered the largest federal investigation into HOA corruption in American history. But they also painted a target on the backs of everyone who'd helped bring Cordelia down, starting with me. The first threat came 3 days after the sentencing, delivered in a way that was both sophisticated and terrifying. I was reviewing legal documents in my home office when my computer screen suddenly went black, replaced by a message in bold red letters: "Some gates should stay closed. Some stories should stay untold. Back off or join Cordelia in federal accommodations." The message disappeared after 30 seconds, leaving no trace in my system except the cold certainty that we'd kicked over a much larger anthill than we'd realized. When I called Marcus Chen to report the incident, his reaction told me he'd been expecting something like this. "Garrett," he said, his voice carrying a tension I'd never heard before, "I need you to listen very carefully. Don't use your home computer or phone for anything sensitive. Don't discuss the case over email or text. And whatever you do, don't let anyone into your house who you don't absolutely trust." That evening, Marcus arrived at my house with 2 companions, who introduced themselves only as federal consultants, but whose bearing suggested military or intelligence backgrounds. They swept my house for surveillance devices and found 3 in my home office and 1 in my kitchen, all professionally installed and completely invisible to casual observation. "Mr. Pemberton," the older consultant said after completing their sweep, "you've stumbled into something that goes far beyond local HOA corruption. Cordelia Whitmore was part of a national network that's been systematically targeting planned communities for development manipulation. Your case didn't just expose one conspiracy, it opened the door to investigating dozens of similar operations across the country. The scope of what they described was staggering. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had identified at least 47 planned communities in 16 states where HOA boards were being used as fronts for discriminatory enforcement and development manipulation. The pattern was always the same: install cooperative HOA leadership, target specific residents for harassment and removal, clear physical obstacles to development, and facilitate below-market property acquisitions for connected development companies. Pinnacle Development wasn't operating alone. The consultant continued. They're part of a consortium of companies that specialize in what they call community optimization, essentially using HOA governance to manipulate entire neighborhoods for profit. But the most disturbing revelation was yet to come. "The reason you're receiving threats," Marcus explained, "is that your case established legal precedent that threatens their entire business model. Other victims are now coming forward with similar stories. and the consortium is facing potential losses in the hundreds of millions of dollars. That's when I learned about the National Community Standards Initiative, a shadowy organization that had been providing training, resources, and coordination to HOA boards across the country. Their public face promoted best practices in community governance, but their real function was teaching HOA leadership how to use discriminatory enforcement without triggering federal civil rights investigations. Cordelia had been one of their star graduates. The evidence the FBI had seized from Pinnacle Development included training materials that were essentially instruction manuals for legal discrimination. They taught HOA boards how to identify problematic residents, how to create facially neutral violations that would disproportionately impact specific groups, and how to coordinate with development companies to maximize property acquisition opportunities. The manual's section on obstacle removal had actually used my gate as a case study, describing the step-by-step process Cordelia had followed to justify its destruction. My family's 70-year-old landmark had become a textbook example of how to eliminate physical barriers to development while maintaining plausible legal cover. But what made the training materials truly chilling was their clinical approach to destroying people's lives. The manual included detailed psychological profiles of different types of homeowners, with specific strategies for applying pressure based on age, race, economic status, and family structure. Elderly residents were targeted with safety violations that would be expensive to address. Families with children faced playground and noise complaints designed to make their homes less enjoyable. Recent immigrants were hit with cultural violations, architectural features, or landscaping that reflected their heritage, were classified as non-conforming aesthetic elements. The Henderson family's harassment hadn't been random cruelty. It had been a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to exploit their specific vulnerabilities as older residents on fixed incomes. The Sanchez family's parking violations weren't petty enforcement. They were part of a strategy that specifically targeted working-class families who couldn't afford multiple vehicles or garage storage. The beautiful thing about their system, Marcus explained with professional admiration for the legal sophistication involved, is that every violation was technically legitimate. They weren't breaking HOA rules, they were applying HOA rules selectively to achieve discriminatory outcomes while maintaining legal cover. 2 weeks after discovering the surveillance devices in my house, the investigation took a turn that none of us had anticipated. I was having coffee with Yolanda Reeves when she received a call that made her face go pale. That was Elena Vasquez from Channel 7. She said, after hanging up, they just got a tip that someone's been following their news crew, photographing their license plates, and trying to identify the sources for their HOA investigation stories. The tip had come from an unexpected source, a security guard at one of the news station's parking garages who'd noticed the same silver sedan circling the area multiple times over the past week. When he'd approached the vehicle to offer assistance, the driver had claimed to be lost. But the guard had noticed professional photography equipment and files containing photos of news station employees. Elena thinks they're trying to identify and intimidate the people who've been talking to reporters. Yolanda continued. She wants to know if we've noticed anyone watching us. That's when I realized I had noticed something. For the past week, I'd seen the same blue pickup truck parked at different locations around the community, sometimes near the entrance, sometimes in the shopping center parking lot, always positioned with a clear view of the main roads through Willowbrook. I'd assumed it belonged to a resident or service worker, but now I understood it was surveillance. Marcus's reaction to this news was swift and decisive. Within hours, he'd contacted the FBI agents handling the expanded investigation, and by evening, federal agents were conducting counter-surveillance throughout our community. What they discovered was a sophisticated intelligence operation designed to identify and intimidate anyone cooperating with the federal investigation. The consortium behind the National Community Standards Initiative had hired a private security firm to monitor not just our community, but similar communities in other states where residents were challenging HOA corruption. The security firm's client list read like a directory of the most powerful development companies in America. They weren't just trying to protect Pinnacle Development, they were trying to prevent the entire house of cards from collapsing, as more victims came forward with similar stories. But their surveillance operation had a fatal flaw. It was being conducted by ex-law enforcement personnel who still thought like cops, not criminals. They documented everything, maintained detailed logs of their activities, and kept meticulous records that would become evidence in their own prosecution. The breakthrough came when federal agents arrested one of the surveillance team members during a routine traffic stop and discovered his vehicle contained files on over 200 people across 12 states, all residents who'd filed complaints against HOA boards or cooperated with federal investigations. The files were incredibly detailed, containing not just basic information like addresses and phone numbers, but psychological profiles, financial records, family relationships, and specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited for intimidation purposes. My file was 3 inches thick and included everything from my tech consulting client list to my coffee shop preferences, along with notes about my emotional attachment to family heritage and recommendations for leveraging historical sentiment if intimidation became necessary. But the file that made my blood run cold belonged to Maria Sanchez, the single mother who'd been targeted with parking violations. The surveillance team had identified her work schedule, her children's school hours, her immigration status, and her extended family members' information that could only be used for purposes that went far beyond legal intimidation. The arrest of the surveillance team leader triggered a domino effect that brought down the entire consortium, faced with federal charges for conspiracy, harassment, and violation of civil rights. He provided detailed testimony about the National Community Standards Initiative's operations across the country. The picture that emerged was of a criminal enterprise that had been operating for over 5 years, systematically corrupting HOA governance in planned communities to facilitate development, manipulation, and discriminatory enforcement. They'd trained over 300 HOA board members, coordinated property acquisitions worth over $800 million, and displaced thousands of families through legal harassment disguised as community standards enforcement. But the most shocking revelation was the identity of the consortium's leadership. The National Community Standards Initiative wasn't run by developers or real estate companies. It was run by former government officials who'd specialized in housing, policy, and civil rights enforcement. The organization's founder was Patricia Kellerman, a former Department of Housing and Urban Development administrator who'd spent 10 years investigating housing discrimination before leaving government service to pursue private sector opportunities. She'd used her expertise in civil rights law to design discrimination schemes that were specifically crafted to avoid federal detection. Air Lieutenant Dr. Richard Ashford was a former fair housing specialist who'd written some of the training materials used by civil rights investigators. He'd leveraged his knowledge of how discrimination cases were built to create discrimination systems that were virtually prosecution-proof. The irony was staggering. The people who designed the most sophisticated discrimination scheme in modern American history were the same people who'd once been responsible for preventing discrimination. They'd turned their expertise in civil rights protection into expertise in civil rights violation. Kellerman's arrest made national headlines and triggered congressional hearings into how former government officials were using their expertise to circumvent the laws they'd once enforced. But for those of us who'd lived through their system, the most satisfying moment came during her perp walk. When reporters asked her to comment on the charges, "This is a politically motivated prosecution," she announced, looking directly into the cameras with the same confidence she'd probably once used to reassure discrimination victims. The National Community Standards Initiative was dedicated to promoting legitimate community governance and protecting property values through established legal processes. It was the same language Cordelia had used, the same deflection and denial that characterized everyone who'd been part of their operation. But this time, the evidence was overwhelming. The victims were organized, and the federal government was committed to prosecution. The trial took place 8 months later in Washington, D.C., and it featured testimony from over 100 victims across 16 states. The Hendersons traveled from Montana to testify about their harassment. The Sanchez family shared their story of systematic intimidation. Dozens of other families described similar patterns of discriminatory enforcement that had forced them to sell their homes and leave their communities. But the testimony that sealed Kellerman's fate came from an unexpected source: Cordelia Whitmore herself. Facing additional federal charges based on evidence uncovered during the consortium investigation, Cordelia had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony provided a detailed inside look at how the discrimination system actually worked. The training was incredibly sophisticated. She testified, looking pale and diminished in her federal prison uniform, They taught us how to identify residents who would be most vulnerable to pressure, how to create violations that would be expensive to fight, and how to coordinate with development companies to maximize property acquisition opportunities. She described the monthly conference calls where HOA board members shared tactics and strategies, the detailed reporting requirements that tracked enforcement success rates, and the financial incentives that rewarded boards for meeting property acquisition targets. It never felt like discrimination. Cordelia continued, her voice barely audible as she described the psychological manipulation that had convinced her she was serving legitimate community interests. They convinced us we were protecting property values and maintaining community standards. The fact that our enforcement actions disproportionately affected certain groups was presented as an unfortunate but unavoidable side effect of necessary governance. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Kellerman received 15 years in federal prison. Ashford got 12 years. The other consortium leaders received sentences ranging from 8 to 10 years. But the most significant outcome wasn't the individual sentences, it was the systemic changes their prosecution triggered. Congress passed the Community Governance Accountability Act, which required HOA boards to maintain detailed records of all enforcement actions and submit annual reports documenting enforcement patterns. The law also established federal oversight of HOA governance in communities that received any form of federal funding or tax benefits. The Department of Housing and Urban Development created a new civil rights division specifically focused on HOA discrimination, with dedicated investigators trained to identify the subtle patterns that characterized modern housing discrimination. Most importantly, the federal courts established clear precedent that discriminatory HOA enforcement constituted a violation of federal civil rights law. Regardless of whether the individual violations were technically legitimate, the legal victory was comprehensive. But the personal victory was even more meaningful. 6 months after the consortium trials ended, I stood in my driveway watching my rebuilt gate gleam in the Montana sunshine, surrounded by neighbors who'd become friends and allies in ways that never would have happened under Cordelia's regime. The Henderson family had become community leaders, serving on the HOA board and ensuring that enforcement was truly equal and fair. The Sanchez family had expanded their business and bought a larger home within the community, no longer afraid that success would make them targets. Yolanda Reeves had transformed the HOA from an instrument of oppression into a genuine community organization that focused on shared amenities and neighborhood improvement rather than enforcement and control. And Marcus Chen had used the precedent established by our case to launch a national practice representing HOA discrimination victims, winning settlements and policy changes that protected homeowner rights across the country. The camping tent that Deputy Marshal Rodriguez had handed to Cordelia had become a symbol that extended far beyond our local situation. Other communities facing HOA corruption began using tent imagery in their protests and legal challenges, representing the basic principle that everyone deserves shelter and security regardless of their background or circumstances. The truth, as we learned, always finds a way to surface when people refuse to stay silent, and when it does, even the most sophisticated conspiracies can be brought down by ordinary people who decide that some things like fairness, equality, and the right to belong in your own community are worth fighting for.